On Mother's Day 2010, my 17-month-old daughter Hudson woke up in the wee hours of the morning crying. She was running a temperature, so I gave her some Tylenol, rocked her, and put her back to bed. Over the course of the day, the fever spiked and receded in cycles. She spent most of that day in my arms, occasionally napping with her head on my shoulder. At one point, I paged the pediatrician, who told me that as long as the fever was responding to medication, we didn't need to take her to the emergency room, even if it spiked to 104, which it later did. Although she had a big meal and went to bed happy, seeming to have turned a corner, the fever persisted overnight, finally spiking up to 103.5 only an hour and a half after a dose of medicine. That was the first time I seriously considered taking her to the ER. But I knew that the pediatrician would open in only 3 more hours, and we had her in the office just after that. Both docs in the practice declared virus and wanted to send us home. I pressed, so they took some urine, some blood, and a chest x-ray and told us to go home to wait. Hudson waved and said bye-bye to the doctor as we left. We waited at home, Hudson again asleep, head on my shoulder. By about 1 o'clock, she wasn't eating or drinking, and I was concerned about her becoming dehydrated. I called the pediatrician again, and she suggested we go on into the ER to get some IV fluids. After a long and agonizing wait there, during which Hudson barely moved from her rest on my shoulder, we were finally seen. When Hudson didn't flinch as the techs put an IV in her arm, I saw them exchange a look. Within hours, she was diagnosed with bacterial meningitis, and several hours after that, she was in a medically induced coma from which she would never wake. 3 days later, she was declared brain dead. All that time, through the shock and the horror and the grief and the pain, one thought wouldn't let me out of its suffocating grasp. If I had just taken her to the emergency room early that morning when her fever spiked soon after a dose of medication, would she have been okay? I'm her mother. Why didn't I save her? On the day Hudson was born, as soon as I saw her, I started tearing off my hospital gown. I'd read about the importance of early skin-to-skin contact for establishing breastfeeding, and I was desperate to get her on my chest, to hold her close so she could smell me and try nursing. On the day Hudson died, we spent every moment beside her, knowing that at around 8:30 that night, the doctors would do a final test for brain death, and that barring some miracle, she would be declared dead. The ICU staff had told us that we could hold her, even though she was hooked up to so many different tubes and machines. At the last minute, I decided to throw everyone but my husband and their nurses out of the room. I took off my shirt and my bra so I could hold her skin to skin again. I thought to myself, wildly, that maybe, just like when she was born, the skin-to-skin contact would have a magical effect. I pictured her in my arms, against my chest, slowly regaining consciousness. It was no easy feat to get her situated in my arms, so wired up she was. She felt so very different from the tiny baby that had been placed on my chest 17 months and 12 days before. So much bigger and yet so lifeless. I wished so hard that she would open her eyes. I thought again, wildly, that if I could just nurse her again, then she would be healed. She slumped against me. Her brain could no longer regulate basic functions, so when they took her out from under her warming blanket, her temperature dropped a bit. I held her and waited, hoping that the skin-to-skin contact would make her temperature rise again, just like it regulates the temperatures of newborns. I waited and was crushed to watch it drop again. I could not save her. My only possible chance to save her had been early that Monday morning, and I had missed it. I have spent 4 years trying to let this go. In the early days after Hudson's death, I heard comedian Louis C.K. joke in an NPR interview that a parent's primary job is to make his kid not die. In those dark days, I remember thinking, Christ, I couldn't even do that. As time has passed, this monster keeps rearing its head, and I keep trying to beat it back. It terrorizes me less now than before. As mothers, we feel that our job, our primary job, is to protect our children. And any outcome, from a bump on the head all the way up to the death of a child, any outcome that is incompatible with that deep sense of responsibility throws us out of orbit. I carried Hudson in my belly for 9 months. I put her to my skin immediately after birth. I nursed her for her whole first year. I made much of her food from scratch with organic ingredients. I kept her away from BPA. I began to research Swedish car seats in which a kid could ride rear-facing until 6 years. Even after I knew she was gone, I still thought I might be able to bring her back. And in the end, none of it saved her. When we so wholeheartedly believe that we are in control of what happens to our children, it is difficult, if not impossible, to concede that maybe we are not in as much control as we thought. Maybe we are not in control at all. And once I learned that hard truth, that's when I could begin to forgive myself.